crowded because we have such a popular speaker today and such demand. So thank you for coming. For those of you new to the room and to this series, I'm John Eckenrode. I'm here to introduce Janis. Janis doesn't need a lot of introduction because many of you know her from various contexts, but I'll give you the short version. Janis is a research scientist in the Bronfman Center here. She got her PhD in human development, and before that she got a public health degree at the University of North Carolina. Before that, she actually had a lot of on-the-ground experience as a health educator for about 10 years or so. Worked a lot around issues of human sexuality, HIV/AIDS, and so forth in the community. This was in Arizona.
Expand all over.
All over the place.
Yeah.
Well, we won't go there.
Yeah. I took sex on the road. No.
The sex on the road. The sex bus or something. She's here today to really talk about the work that has come out of a very vigorous program, the Cornell Research Program on self-injury and recovery, which has many strands to it, including some very basic epidemiological research that she's done. She's really helped build the field of self-injury and with her professional work and networks that she's built. But she's really, and she has much, and that has included also a lot of now very practice-oriented work, reaching out to various constituencies, including practitioners, teachers, and parents. And today the focus is going to be on parents, the parent piece of this sort of translational aspects of the work she's been doing. Janis has also very broad-ranging interests beyond self-injury around youth development, youth health, mental health, and so forth. But in the limited time we have today, and she will only be able to cover a certain amount of that ground. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I always find it a little nerve-wracking to present at home. Like, I can go out in the world and talk to lots and lots of different people, and I don't feel very nervous. But when it's home, there's something that's kind of nerve-wracking about it. Plus, I haven't ever done this talk before, so it always helps when you've thought through all the transitions. They may be a little bit rougher, but I really wanted to just give you. First, I want to acknowledge where this comes from, because the genesis of this particular, the genesis of everything that I've done is not been me. It's been a whole variety of people. So I want to thank my lab, all the students past and present who've been in the lab, as part of the lab since we started 2004, and a bunch of them are here from this year. And really, truly, without them, there would not, the translational focus that I hold so dear, in terms of being able to do research and then try to create materials and initiatives that are of value to the people like many of you who are doing things on the ground, just wouldn't be possible without students. They're just, when we have brilliant, strong-minded, and focused students who are really dedicated to doing something in the world. So I'm so thankful for them. And I'm particularly thankful to Mandy Purrington, Carrie Earnhout, and Laura Dedman, who have been the study coordinators over time. And none of the stuff we've done could have happened without them. And particularly to the students, Rebecca Morgan, Kamar Prusin, and Fevin Fishia, who worked on some of these data that I'm going to present. I just wanted to quickly stop and pause and ask you a little bit about who you are. Could you just raise your hand if you work directly in direct services with youth or families in some way? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. And then academics, primarily academics? Okay. And students of some sort, grad student, undergrad? Okay, all right, good, that's what I thought. So most of what I'm going to focus on today, I'm going to talk research, and I'm going to tell you sort of where we got things, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the kinds of details that most researchers would probably be very interested in. We will talk about some methods and that kind of stuff, but not a lot. I'm really going to focus on what we've learned that may be of value to those of you who are here for practices, because you want to be able to take something away with you. So I'm also going to try to span a very big, we could easily be here for several hours talking about all the different things that we've learned, but I'm going to try to condense a lot into a short period of time. So I want to talk a little bit about how we came to be interested in parents, because it wasn't the study focused at all for this program when it started, and then talk about two in particular parent studies. One was focused on parent-child dynamics post-disclosure, so post-finding out that their child self-injured. And then the secondary strain piece, which grew very much directly out of that first study, because we started to really notice that independent of effects on children and youth and the family system, there are direct effects on parents that we really need to be paying attention to, because they are really clearly critical resources for young people, and not just conceptually. I was seeing that empirically very strongly, and I'll share a little bit about that in a minute. And then I want to talk a little bit about what we've learned and what it means for practice. So I told you just a minute ago, I've never done this talk before, which means I don't know that it will fit in the time we have. I think that it will. I'm going to try to make it fit. And I apologize, A, in advance if it doesn't totally fit, B, that there's some pretty packed slides, because somehow psychologically it feels like maybe I can get through more if we put more on one slide. I don't know. I know a lot of us have that. I'm just telling you, I know, I'm aware of it, but it's not too bad. And let me know if I'm talking too fast, okay? So if somebody just wants to go like this, that will tell me to slow down a little. Okay. So first I thought I should just tell you briefly about what non-suicidal self-injury is, because I think most people probably have heard of it by now, but maybe not everybody. Non-suicidal self-injury is the deliberate, direct, and self-inflicted destruction of tissue for purposes not socially sanctioned and without suicidal intent. And as the recent DSM-5 has stipulated, it's intended as a means of regulating emotion. That's kind of a new addition. So I'm not going to I will be sharing all our NSSI-focused data, but I want to emphasize that I think a lot of the trends that we find with parents are trans NSSI. They're not just about self-injury. They're very applicable to parents dealing with normatively developing adolescents who are struggling with probably a whole wide variety, one or more mental health challenges for reasons that will become clear in a minute. So but this has sort of been the epicenter of our studies, and although I'm saying I think that the lessons learned go beyond self-injury. And considering that 25% of adolescents have DSM classifiable mental health disorders in the current day of age, many of which are not diagnosed or being followed in treatment, a lot of this impact is happening on parents. There's a very strong fallback on parents. So before there were parents, well, not before there were parents, before there were parents in my world, we were focused on these things. We started this program in 2004 with a very strong and important support of both John Eckenrode and Jane Powers. I also want to acknowledge, because without their support, this would never have happened. But we were focusing on trying to figure out a phenomenon that was fairly new at the time. There was not a lot of literature and not a lot of just basic information about what is this, how, the who, what, where, when, why, and how much questions. So that's really where we started. We were also interested in identifying potential sources of social contagion. So that big question of where is this coming from? I understand the appeal of pretty much everything that teenagers and adults do related to what we call risk behaviors, sex, drugs, food. But self-injury is kind of an interesting phenomenon because you're actually using pain to feel better, and that paradox, especially the potential violence of it, literally the fact that you have to cut yourself or hurt yourself, was something I was having a hard time wrapping my brain around, but it was showing up alive. And we were really interested in provider experiences and approaches, of the people out there working in youth-serving systems. What were they seeing? How were they thinking about it? What were they doing? And then we were hoping to use all this information to develop intervention and system protocols. So we have done that. But parents started to kind of come to the surface from the very beginning. So we did two big epi studies at the beginning. One was a 2-college survey of Princeton and Cornell, and we followed that up with an 8-college survey with a wide variety of universities, some of which were Ivy League, some of which weren't, with the goal of really establishing the epi, and it was a random representative sample. We used a lot of analytical techniques to make sure that we could extrapolate to the larger population, at least of college students. And I used this opportunity to gather a whole bunch of information about mental health and other things I kind of was interested in. So one of them was just this question of, so this is 2006 when this particular data piece started. How often, so remember that, it's like cell phones, but it's slightly pre-text. I think the first flip phones were in, but they weren't in wide use. Is that right, Elliot? You might check. I don't remember they were widely on the scene, but we asked a bank of questions about who people were talking to and or how often they were talking to families. And one of the things that blew my mind at the time, not so much anymore, was this. And this was true for across all 4 years of college and across all 8 universities. So most people, so I'm going to college in 84 to 88, and my parents were very lucky to hear from me once a week, if that. And of course, technological, and like the phone was down the hall in the dorm. It just was harder to talk. 29.7% of our students across all these universities said they talked to their parents at least once a day, and a whole chunk of them said multiple times a day. And so I was like, wow. After I got over the wow, and I came back and asked our RAs, what do you talk about? Because somebody flipped open her phone. She's a senior, and she said she called her dad 5 times that day. And I said, what do you talk about? And she said, well, he saw some cute puppy when we were out. He was out walking, and I saw something at the store I thought he'd like. I was like, wow, it's like they're still there. And I'm sure if we ask now and we factor in text and all that stuff, it would be much, much more. So one of the first things is, well, even when people are in college, well after they have left home, they still have a very strong parental connection and presence. And that wasn't, however, the focus of some of the research we were doing, so I didn't formally write that up, but I started to really pay attention. I sat on my couch one night and started to dig around for, do communication patterns differ by whether or not they have self-injury or not? And we found only very modest difference in daily communication by self-injury status when controlling for a variety of things. Without controlling for a variety of things, there was no difference. When I put a variety of other things in the picture, there was some. So if we looked at any self-injury versus no self-injury, you see 23.7 versus 27.8. I circumscribed the data set to really only be the undergraduates. So just so you know, this is just undergraduates. Current self-injury, so people who were chronically and currently walking around injuring as their primary or a primary mode of emotion regulation, you see a little bit more of a difference, but that's not radically different, right? We had one measure on the survey of well-being that included the self-injury measures that asked about perceived family warmth in high school, because the interviews we had done prior to this point suggested that may be a contributor, and it makes logical sense that, if stuff is hard at home or stuff is hard with families, that it may be contributing to the onset and maintenance of self-injury. And we did find, as we expected, that there was some difference between those two, but again, it wasn't radical. We also asked a very detailed sequence around disclosure. So this is a bank of questions. So somebody said that they had self-injured, and we took them through all of our screening items to assure that they were should truly be on the self-injury track. We then asked a bunch of items about, well, who knows and who's had a conversation, who initiated that conversation, and how helpful was it, and then who suspects but hasn't spoken to you, and would you want them to speak? And there was a drop down for every single category person you could imagine. What was really striking, in addition to the self-injury questions I just told you about, there was a general question that everybody in the study got about who they talked to when they were sad, anxious, or depressed. So this first one was parents showed up over and over again, a second only to peers, of course, as the identified confidants when sad, anxious, or depressed, and that was across the entire data set. But when we drilled down into self-injury, they were the second only to peers to know about self-injury, and they were the second most likely to suspect self-injury. But here's where things get even more interesting to me. Parents were hands down, and we asked about all sorts of people, physicians, therapists, coaches. I mean, it was like 19 different categories of people. Parents were absolutely the most helpful category of person to talk about self-injury to. 42% found it helpful if they had actually had a conversation, and the next big chunk of people found it, they didn't know whether it was helpful, but it wasn't that. It was only a very small minority that found that conversation unhelpful, regardless of who initiated it, which was really interesting and important to me. And 65.3% of those who had suspicious parents, who thought something might be going on, said that they wished they would talk to them. So one of the things, and now mind you, these are college students, so these are people who are not necessarily living in a house with a parent who would be observing it. But it was so clear when we started to really drill down into these that parents continue to be very connected, and they are really, really important in the recovery process, regardless of how they may have contributed to the onset and maintenance. So we also there was a longitudinal component to that 8-college study where we followed up people for 3 years up through 5 colleges, and one of the big studies we did out of that, and Elliot was part of that, was looking at how does self-injury predict, what predicts whether somebody who has non-suicidal self-injury is likely to move into suicide? Because that's a big, important question, right? How much do we worry, and how do we figure out how to flag the people who may very well get to the edge of the bridge? And first of all, we found that very few of the millions of variables that we have, somebody crawling through the aisle, very few of the millions of variables, not millions, but many variables that we had in that analysis predicted the movement or lack of movement into the suicide realm. But one of the most prominent protective factors was parents. So if young people reported parents as a confidant when sad, anxious, or depressed, they were likely to talk to them, they were 3.3 times less likely to move on to any suicidal behavior. That was it was one of the strongest effects of the small numbers of variables. So by this time, we're starting to think, wow, parents are clearly really important, and the relationship between what's happening as someone's moving through the sort of self-injury trajectory or probably any mental health challenge trajectory is much more complicated than the very simple questions that we often tend to ask, which is what do parents do to cause it? It just drives me nuts. The literature often gets very distilled to like parent contribution. And they're there, but it was clearly showing, we were clearly seeing, especially when we move into the next phases of the study, that it's a much, much trickier question and process than we expected. But that no matter what, if parents can be engaged, especially in the recovery process, and I know they can't always be engaged, and they probably aren't always the most productive people to have engaged, I know that. But if they can be, then it is really, really helpful. But they're probably going to need a fair amount of support independent of their child. So just in terms, I'll stop for a minute and tell you a little bit about what we were seeing in the literature. So we started seeing all this at about the same time that other people in our field were starting to look at it. And the role of parents in self-injury processes has been increasingly well documented. People often start at the right place, which is what's the parental contribution, the family contribution to onset and maintenance. And we see that there is, but again, we're talking in terms of averages. There are plenty of families that we were interviewing later where there really wasn't a clear contributing role. It's discussed largely in terms of contributions to self-injury onset and/or maintenance, as I just said. There was one exception in 2007 when they were looking at self-injury as a social statement, as an attempt to connect, as an attempt to get attention. And what they found, is the role of self-injury, and actually does among young adolescents enhance the relationships with the father. So oftentimes there's a social bid to enhance connection by bringing attention in this way for some people, and that it worked. In a lot of cases, what was sort of a disconnected child-father relationship was somewhat became more connected over time as a result of having to navigate this together. That was interesting. But it was one of the only studies that looked at something a little more complex than the first two. So I stopped at this point, and I started to get really fascinated by two pieces of this emerging portrait from the literature as well as from our work and my own experience as a parent of 5 adolescents. One is now 24. So one is, it's so clear that the role of parents isn't static. It's not like parents play one role. They contribute, something that happens in the family contributes to the onset of self-injury, and voila, that's it. That's the full story. There's a much more dynamic story, and we really don't have a lot of ways of modeling that story. and that it's clearly not unidimensional. But we have a lot of models of child development that show that there are bidirectional effects. So parents, as just the shapers of young people, is a very limited way of thinking about it. And I have a lot of this, I'm sure everybody in the room who's a parent knows. You probably have different parenting approaches with different kids because they pull different things out of you and need different things. And some are more complicated and messy than others. So as I started to get really interested in what that effect might be. The best lens for studying the reciprocal effects that we could find at the time was best understood through secondary stress. So this idea that there might be some unique action on the parent or in the parent toward the parent as a result of having to kind of deal on a day-to-day basis with the stress of the child that has an effect on the parent which may undermine or enhance their ability to support their children. So that there's a dynamic bidirectional exchange going on. And then the other thing that was really interesting when we started to really look at the secondary stress literature is it's pretty much confined to either elder care or to secondary stress as a result of caring for a young person who, like a child with a developmental delay or some kind of other serious and usually visible issue. There's much less, I wouldn't say there's no, but there's much less literature in the secondary stress that comes from parenting a child who looks and in most ways is functioning normally in the world. That carries some pretty unique kinds of pieces to it. For self-injury, and I know this is true for probably a lot of conditions, but for self-injury in particular, it's often chronic, but it's silent. It's very easy to hide. So most people in the world, even the world of the family, like sometimes even siblings or the other parent, if there is one, or extended family members may not have any idea. It's just really hard to see, so it's invisible. It's generally episodic, meaning that it comes and goes in waves. So people can injure for a lot for a certain period of time, and then they can stop for months or years. And for parents, this means it leaves them walking on eggshells. Like you just never know when it might come back, and you don't want to. There's this fear that something's going to trigger it, or you just don't know. Are we out of the woods? Is this it? Have we arrived? Or, wow, here it comes again. And that it occurs within the context of normal development. This worry that it's a reflection on the family or the parent. Like, what did we do wrong that we have a child who's struggling with this is something that we heard over and over again. So there is a little bit of literature now on the parental experience of self-injury. There are 5 studies of secondary stress, not in the ways that we defined it, but just they did, most of them are phenomenological. There's 4 that are entirely quantitative. They were really just trying to surface what might be going on, which is the perfect place to start. We did something similar. And you can see by the dates, most of this is happening at about the same time we're getting interested in it too. So we didn't have none of us had the advantage of being able to lean on anything at that point. There's one small quantitative study with a quant component that was recent. The studies overall find, as you would probably expect, that it's associated with feelings of shame, guilt, and/or responsibility. I think this is heavily linked to the normativeness issue. If it's not as though you can say, well, it's a genetic anomaly and there's not a reason for it that makes any sense. And there's really a lot of increased uncertainty about how to parent effectively, especially in regard to managing conflict and communication. Once you find out, there's a lot of everything just is thrown up in the air in terms of expectations and boundaries and how to navigate those conversations when you have this thing that could be very, very disruptive sort of happen. And there's concern that standard parenting approaches are going to trigger worse or more self-injury. So a lot of power struggles or boundary issue questions. And then the last thing that they show consistently is a real lack of social support and resources for managing the stress associated with having a child who's self-injured. And I have to say, in all the interviews that we've done and all the conversations I've talked with parents, this shows up is almost always the very first piece how do I connect my child with care? Like, how do I connect my child to resources that are going to help? And that's a tricky question because there's lots of resources, but very few of them are actually helpful, particularly for self-injury. But you know what, the one thing the parent never asks about, and it's become one of the things I say from the very beginning, is what about you? Because it's great, your kid definitely needs support, but this is a really stressful experience for parents, and you need independent support. And it's fascinating because there's almost always a pause. They have never thought about it, and they often don't even have a clue about how to start thinking about it, because it somehow maybe feels selfish to be focusing on their own support and care when what they really, really want to do is to be helping their child. But that's a really big piece. What was unknown at the time that we reviewed all this literature is the magnitude of stress above and beyond normal parenting. How much more does it add? I mean, just being a parent of normally functioning, healthy teenagers is stressful, as anybody who's parented them knows. So how much above and beyond is that? A variation across types of stress. Not all, we say stress as though it's one construct. It's actually many, and in the most widely used strain measure, there are 3. So it's what they call objective stress or strain, which is logistic, resources. Does it interfere with day-to-day life in terms of timing and money and access and stuff? But then there's what they call the subjective components, which does it generate negative emotions toward the child? That would be a subjective external. And the subjective internal is, does it generate negative emotions towards itself? So I liked this conceptualization, and it was analytically easy to work with, so we stuck with that. And then nobody's looked at all about predictors or correlates of strain or expectancies about well-being outcomes for self and child. One of the things that's really clear about self-injury, and I know is true for almost all mental health challenges with teenagers, is that it's a process. It's not a day. It's not a moment. It's often a long time, and it can be hard to just take the long view and hope and believe that it's all going to be fine when you're just living in it day after day. How do parents think about what is down the road with regards to themselves, their child, and their relationship was something we were really interested in. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 2 study aims. We've done a little bit more than that, but I'm going to talk about 2 studies we did and what we found. We were interested in what the parental experience was of having a self-injurious child. We really wanted to do interviews, talk to us about what that is. How do you perceive the effects on family dynamics, and what was their personal experience? Do parents of youth with self-injury experience significantly higher rates of stress? We assumed so, but how much more, and how do we conceptualize that? What's the nature of the strain, and then what predicts it, and especially of what predicts it? What might we be able to moderate, do something about, or mitigate, sorry. How do parents describe the impact and expectancies related to their well-being and their child's well-being? So study 1 was really focused on the dyad. We did a mixed method study. We did a survey prior to an interview. We did an interview, which in-person, Skype, or call, because a lot of our participants were not here locally. And we did a post-survey after 1 year. I'm not going to talk about those results. The sample was, because it was a dyad study and we didn't have a large amount of funding, the sample wasn't huge, and so the follow-up component is not something I would put a lot of stock in, but it's interesting for generating my thinking. And we looked at basically so we talked to each, the parent and the child, separately. And I'll tell you a little about who was in the sample in just a minute. But we were interested in everybody's description of the self-injury epidemiology and trajectories, disclosure processes, recovery process, the treatment experience, and then the effects. So we talked with them separately and then wanted to really compare their descriptions. So the population for this were parents of young people 15 to 24, where at least one parent knew about the self-injury, and we excluded anybody who had a significant, I think it was more than, I can't remember, 2 weeks or 1 month combined institutionalized stay, or some very, had a lot of psychosis. We really were looking at what might approximate sort of a community population. We interviewed them and their children. We recruited through our networks. We had 25 parents, 32 youth, 17 dyads, and 4 triads, which is interesting. So where we got 2 parents and a child, and we had one where there was one mother and she talked about, she did 2 separate interviews because she had 2 children who injured. So we did one about her son and then one about her daughter. The parents were 18 mothers, largely had mothers, 4 fathers, 2 heterosexual couples. Wait, does that make sense? Oh, yeah, because that was the triad. 54% of the parents were partnered with a first partner, 18.2 were repartnered, not first, 18.2 divorced, not currently partnered, 9.1 never partnered, and 4.5 widowed. So it was a fair diversity, even though the sample size was small. The average age of the young people was 17. We had 3 males and the remainder females. I just got to pause here and say, every study that is done on NSSI epidemiology shows almost parity in male and female self-injury. It's not quite the same, but it's very, very close. And yet, if you try to recruit to talk to people who injure, it is just impossible to get guys. It's really hard. So they are much, much quieter, and they have slightly different forms. It looks a little bit different in males and females, but it's very, this is one of the biggest challenges, is trying to understand really the male perspective on this, because they don't show up in studies very often. 77.3 were of European descent, and we had other folks in there too, 2 Hispanic and 1 African American, Asian American, and Native American. All youth had seen a mental health professional, and most had at least one other diagnosed mental health condition. I'm not sure that this comes up again later, but just in case it doesn't, one of the things that was really striking when we did a comparative study, because we did look at parents who didn't have a kid with mental health issues, and parents who had kids with self-injury history, is there are 2 very big differences. One, most of the young people obviously had a mental health issue as part of the criteria of the study, but the parents, there was a very, very big difference in the percentage of parents who had also felt like they had struggled with a mental health issue, much higher among people who had a self-injurious child than people who had a child that didn't feel like struggled with any mental health issue. That was really fascinating. So basically, there are a lot, for the dyad study, we looked at a lot of different things, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about the perceptions of this epidemiology, because it's kind of interesting. Age of onset, parents and youth generally agreed. Youth said the average age of onset for youth was 13.9. Parents, the average age was 14.3. That's largely a reflection of the lag in finding out. Form was really low agreement. So, and this has come out of multiple studies now. There's broad agreement. Like, I think most of them, 90% of the youth and the parents said that cutting was happening, but very, very few parents knew that other forms are being used. So just FYI, for people who work with people with self-injury, if someone chronically injures, 70% of them are going to probably be using more than one form. It's not usually just one form. But they clearly really didn't want to talk to parents about that. So parents really often did not know. Only one parent knew that there was greater than one form. Cessation, very low agreement. Again, parents often presumed that self-injury had completely stopped when the youth said it hadn't completely stopped. And, I think that a lot of what came out of these interviews with the young people was a really strong desire to protect their parents and, of course, to save face or to not feel like they failed. But that's, again, really low agreement. Function was interesting. When we asked people about the why, all parents, every one of them looked for the big picture. They immediately went to what happened in my child's life or in our family life that might have set the stage for this. Youth never talked about that. When you had to specifically ask them what they think might be connected, they almost always reported on the, here and now. My boyfriend broke up with me, and it really hurt, or I noticed that I do it when I have a certain kind of feeling. But this big picture versus immediate proximal thing was really striking. Everybody agreed that it reflected difficulty expressing and dealing with negative thoughts and feelings. That everybody was on the same page there. But the other questions around why were very different. The thematic findings from the interviews with the parents only, I'm not reporting the young people and I'm not reporting sort of the dyad here, but where isolation is the norm. Lots and lots of parents, this goes back to the getting of support. and has clear practice analog here. Really common for parents to feel isolated, really common for them not to have told anybody or very, very few people out of embarrassment. And that's a problem. It's really a problem because they often don't then have the backup they need to bring themselves sort of fully into the process of recovery that's really kind of a slog at times. Feeling responsible and embarrassed, and again, that ties back to, my child is functionally normal in a lot of other ways. There's some implication that I did something wrong to cause this. A lot of them showed lack of knowledge. They just had no idea what this is, how to understand it, how to contextualize it. And that fear often caused a strong negative reaction upon finding out. So the fear translated into anger for a lot of parents quickly, so the first conversation was sometimes a bit dicey. Mismatch in process timing was really an interesting phenomenon. I'd love to dig more into this, but it's so clear that for a lot of the young people, they've been injuring for a while. By the time their parent finds out, they've already got some stuff figured out. But the parent finds out, and this is brand new, and they're like back at square one trying to figure out what's going on. And there's just this, it was an interesting dynamic of a parent just being really early in the understanding, the discovery phase, and a lot of times the young person's like, I've been living with this for a really long time. So that the different needs in different places, I think, have some interesting implications for treatment, especially for people who work with families. Parenting in the wake of disclosures goes back to something we talked about. Just how do we do rules? How do we deal with it when they say if I have to not come home tonight, or if I have to come home tonight by 10, I'm going to cut or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of power struggles that get very odd and hard to navigate with this information sort of in the mix. The biggest issue I saw was keeping connection alive in the face of different expectancies. This is a tricky one because there are definitely young people, we're young people in the study, who are not ready to totally stop. They see maybe someday, but they're not quite there yet. And of course, parents are like, I need this to end. This is really not good. You really need to not be doing this. And keeping the parent-child connection alive in the wake of very different placements around self-injury and the parents' confrontation of powerlessness was a really big thing. When parents call to talk, it's one of the things that always comes up is they're just powerless. It's not within their jurisdiction to stop what they're doing. They can't. So they have to live with this whole new experience that's totally their experience. It's not their child's experience. This is their experience of like letting go of having control of what somebody they love so much is doing that they know is hurtful. And they could get in and fix right away if they would let them. It's really, really hard. Maintaining, and linked to that, maintaining hope in dark times. It can sometimes go on for quite a while. And that leads inevitably to stretching boundaries in oneself. And this is where I'll come back to this in a minute because this got very interesting. Like there was clearly there's the child journey with self-injury and all that goes along with it and the mental health struggles, and then the family journey. But each parent seemed to be taking their own journey through their own sort of times, and that was leading to a lot of different kinds of epiphanies or understandings or insights, some of which were great and some of which were really hard. One of the things that was super clear is that self-injury, especially in the chronic form, really opened up a greater need and opportunity for authenticity and communication in the family. I mean, there was no, if the family had patterns of kind of avoiding things, this was one of the things that shook the apples on the tree a lot. So people talked a lot about how it affected how they talked. And then really, one of the things that comes up over and over again is dealing with the limits of professional treatment. We always have this idea that if you can get people into treatment, we're good, okay, it's all good. I mean, sometimes it's just a beginning point, and sometimes it makes things worse. So that's one of the reasons why helping to equip parents with the perseverance and the perspective and the knowledge to be able to kind of be the coach, be a coach for themselves is really important, because a lot of times therapy it might help a little bit, but sometimes it didn't help at all. And you know, the child could say, I'm not going to see that therapist anymore, and that relationship is severed, but they all come back home together. So the people that are sitting at home over and over and over, day after day, are the parents, the kids, the siblings. So I wanted to, oh, no I don't, okay. I'll come back to the same time. Study 2 is recruited through online solicitation and websites as well as web-based networks. We basically looked for parents with no mental health challenge and people who had kids who injured. You can see the composition there. We had far more self-injury parents than non, which was really, I didn't think it was going to be so hard. I don't know if we weren't getting, we went through the same channels, but I don't know. I think there's not that many parents out there who don't have kids who are struggling. That was one of my interpretations, honestly. We were really focused here on the parent. It was mixed methodology, web-based survey. We looked at secondary stress. I'll tell you what in a minute, the contributors to that stress and the outcome expectancies. And I was really particularly interested in personal growth, partly because I have the youth development and the positive-oriented part of me really wants. I'm very interested in how people make use of adversity to grow at all ages. How is it that we do that, and how can we support doing that in other people? And then hopefulness. So this was kind of our general model, but it was, since there's really not very much literature to guide it, and since we were really just winging it, especially when we did this, we were sort of guessing. So these were the basic parent mental health history, child mental health history, therapeutic support for child, basically they sought treatment. Parent support structure, which was whether they'd gone to treatment, whether they, or as a counselor just for support, whether they perceived support from their informal network, and how many people they talked to in their informal network. Child self-injury characteristics, which if we go back and do more of this, we really need to do better. It's just that we didn't have the kids, so the kids couldn't tell us truly the self-injury characteristics. All we had was the parent reports, which we knew from the last study are usually not very reliable. And then psychosocial characteristics of parenting. And so we looked at mindful parenting, trait optimism, sense of coherence, acceptance of emotion. Because they were all highly correlated in the models, we ended up just using mindful parenting and trait optimism for this. So the secondary stress measures were the caregiver strain questionnaire, and it measured these 3 categories, and they're the things that I sort of mentioned earlier, the objective and then the 2 subjective strains, which is negative feelings directed toward the child, and then internal strain directed toward oneself. The mindful parenting, I thought I'd just tell you really quickly, because there were 5 different, it's fairly new. There were 5 subscales, and we used 4 of them because only 4 factored nicely in our population. Listening with full attention, non-judgment of self and child, compassion for self and child, and self-regulation in parenting. Those are some examples of the kinds of items that are used. So in order to do the differences by stress in the NSSI and the control group, we matched them on child sex, parent sex, and ethnicity, because these were the only things that were significantly different. And you can see that there's a really big difference in pretty much every one of these areas, especially the perception of self, especially the inward-directed negative emotions. And this is where the support for parents piece should come again. The predictors of objective strain were these. Now, the objective strain is the logistical resource, and it was probably the most interesting one in terms of the direction of effects. And I ran this a bunch of different times and really, scratched my head over it quite a bit. But basically, this is the final model. This is not the univariate model. This is the final model. So the final model is when, with everything that was significant, when we put it in just one at a time, was all put in together. These were all the things that come out, and we have an adjusted R-squared of 0.48, which is very, very high. So we're explaining 48% of the variance in this with these. And so the oddity here is it looks like everything is directly positively related, and so this is the only one that didn't make a lot of sense. So I think the best way to interpret this potentially is parent formal therapy and child therapy are almost always positively related to whatever more negative outcome you're looking at, because it's a proxy for severity. Usually people will go seek help when it's worse, so that's what you're probably seeing there. Feeling responsible for the child and non-judgment of self and child, which is the other direction. So a higher non-judgment of self and child is less judgment. Those predict higher strain, I think, conjecture here, is probably because those parents are more likely to go seek help, and that help-seeking interferes with daily life more, right? You can't have more daily life interference if you don't actually go to seek the strength. Go to seek the resources. So that's that. This was interesting. The subjective strain, this is, external negative feelings about the child was not explained by very much. Number of mental health challenges and more judgment of the self or child, which makes sense. But we were explaining about 20% of the variance there. And the internal strain is the self. These were lower perceived report, feeling more responsible for the child's self-injury, going to therapy, which is good, means that they're probably getting help, and then child has received therapy. And again, we explained a high percentage of the variance there. So, key themes here is that in comparison to parents of youth without burdens, parents of NSSI positive youth do exhibit elevated levels of stress in all areas of functioning, but it's complex and it looks different in different areas of functioning. Mindful parenting practices exert effects in all models, but in different ways across different types. And I focus on mindful parenting because that is something you can teach. There's actually a fair number of decent curricula now for helping parents learn to be more mindful in direct relationship with their child. Although externalities are affected, the largest impact is related to personal feelings of guilt and worry, and a lot of what's driving this is feeling responsible. So if there's a target set of messages for parents that any of you are working with, it's helping them to work through the feelings they may be having about how they might have contributed. The number of other mental health challenges is just an issue that parents perceive. So the number of other mental health challenges was not diagnoses, because not everybody's always seen a therapist and gotten diagnosed. So we asked people if they perceived that their child struggled with that, and that seems to add unique variance to each strain type. And then, of course, informal social support plays a really big role, especially in a practical strain and subjective internalized strain. All right, so I'll do this in 3 minutes and we'll have a Q&A. This was one of my the thing I was most interested in is outcome expectancy. So we asked them about whether they, quantitative and qualitatively, how optimistic they were that they would experience personal, meaningful growth for themselves, independent of their child. And then we also asked about whether they were hopeful or optimistic that they would experience that for their child. So for child is blue and for themselves is red. And you can see that most people feel really optimistic that they are going to personally grow and that their child is going to personally grow. This is good, because and it turns out that feeling hopeful is really important. It's really, really important. So that for those of you who work with parents, being able to not frame whatever their child is dealing with as, oh, it's horrible. Don't do that if you can avoid it. It's hard, but you can make it through. You do make it through, and not only can you survive it, but lots of people expect to do better than that. They expect to grow as human beings and be better people in the world. When we asked about this, because we asked about all of them, here's what people said. So that I'm going to show you a series of slides with the different domains that came out of the thematic analysis, going from least common to most common. So the least common were negative, perceived negative impact on a child. I'm not going to read the examples. You can read those if we don't have time. But one of those was fear for child's future and possibilities for a good life. And the other area was criticism or negative judgment of child. And when those came up in qualitative form, as you can see, some of them were pretty intense. So that's definitely something, and that came out 22.2% of the 157 people or 97 people that participated perceived that there might be negative impact. Negative impact on the parent, focused primarily on compromised self-regard, sort of their failure as a parent in some way. And then negative impact on social relationships outside of family. This is where people tried to confide or to get support from a friend or something, but it was just too much for them to bear, and that was impactful back on the parent. So they often just avoid it. And then a negative impact on family relationships. So source of of negative or corrosive feelings for the family as a whole. There was definitely among some people, a very strong fear that this was going to have a lasting negative impact forever on the family, and then, of course, strain on critical resources. Most of these involve something like this, that there's a lot of time and energy spent, but there was another subset of comments around just not being able to find providers and having to spend a lot of time looking for somebody who might be able to help. Okay, going up, the next biggest category was positive impact on parents, and the things that they tended to say were that they acquired new skills or sense of perspective, that it had a positive impact on social relationships outside the family. The next biggest was positive impact on perceptions of their child. So I heard this comes up a lot. They really felt like their child was improving their self-awareness and coping skills. There was a lot of really, really wonderful quotes and comments around that. And that they noticed that their child had improved social relationships as a result of some of the things that they were learning in the process of going through this. Positive impact on family relationships was quite a few comments about bringing families closer together, and definitely this was a big category in general, just increased honest communication and authenticity. So that's another framing piece in terms of practice. Being able to frame this is very, very difficult, but it opens up opportunities for learning new skills as a family that might actually make things better. So in sum, parents matter a lot in the recovery process in significant ways, even if their children are not living at home. The reactions to disclosure matter. What happens after, continued connection, conversation, honesty matters. The in the trenches nature of the relationship, they're a really important resource because they're the ones who are there every day, even if they're not living there. They're there through text, through phone. Being able to support parents in learning how to cultivate whatever skills they need to in order to support their kid is a really good investment. Parenting youth with self-injury or other mental health challenges is really stressful on caretakers in ways that affect their own well-being and likely as a byproduct their child. That's a study I'd like to be able to do, is sort of the reciprocal effects on children. We haven't gotten there yet. Much of the stress can be accounted for by the overall mental health burden for the child and the parent, inadequate support for oneself in formal and informal ways, feeling responsible for the behavior, which is compounded by the sin versus sickness and walking on eggshells phenomenon. The sin versus sickness is that goes back to that idea that if you can see it, if it's a clear sickness, it's clear that somebody is suffering and that's going to affect you, then socially we're much more accommodating and supportive. If we feel like, well, somebody did something wrong and that's why your child is messed up, then we are typically socially not so accommodating. And the parent-child relationship and uncertainty in the wake of disclosure, frustration with the limits of treatment and resources. So what does this all mean for practice? Here, I'm just going to put these up, and I think I'll stop right here for now because this is all but the last slide, and I'll put that up in a second. Basically, caretakers need validation. They need resources for accurate information. They need to be supported, and they need to be encouraged to seek support for themselves, ideally therapeutic support, especially if they have a kid who's chronically suffering or struggling with something, because the day-in, day-outness of it is really tough. And support for effective and mindful parenting practices. So this piece of helping parents to not just get support, but to extend their own abilities, especially in the areas of emotion regulation and cognition and reframing, is really helpful because they are social models. They're models for their kids. So that's a sort of we didn't talk a lot about that, but that's a psychoeducational piece that we'll be working on next. Is not just, how do you turn the gaze on your child and help them, but turn the gaze on yourself. And, it may be a little uncomfortable to realize that you have some not so great patterns that are probably being picked up by your child or affecting your child, and you can control that. That's something you can work on. And then how to validate and support this hopeful, optimistic orientation. Hey, we have 3 minutes. Sorry. Yes, ma'am.
I've got 2 questions. They're potentially really quick, though.
Okay.
I work with the Reference Center and I'm part of the Collaborative Solutions Network, which
Yes.
looks to change the system of care and how we provide services to kids and families in town. If anybody's interested, I encourage you to Google it. I'm wondering, when you said that it's shown an enhanced connection with fathers, I'm wondering if there was any gender bias there, and I understand that you only had 3 males in the sample.
No, this is a different study.
Oh, okay. I'm wondering if, like, dads connected with their sons in the same way that they connected with their daughters.
That's a great question, and if you email me, I will email you that article, because I don't remember off the top, but usually most of the studies draw on many more females than males. So my guess is that if there's a gender bias, it's probably either because we can't know since there's not enough males in the sample, but especially early self-injury, injury, and that they were looking at middle school age is more common. Girls tend to start a little bit earlier. So my guess is there would be a gender bias to favoring female fathers, but I don't know, but I will send you the study.
Thank you.
Okay.
And the other question, I was just wondering if you got any information that was specific to teens who identified as LGBT.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, so that's a whole other topic, but that category of teens, especially the bi in the middle of the range, are at much higher risk for self-injury, like especially if they're female. The parenting issues that are related to this and also to that are going to be, they're just going to add a whole other unique dimension to it. And we haven't looked at that in particular, but there are some people who are starting to do that. I just don't think there's any studies out yet, but it's going to be there because we know that identity exploration and uncertainty is a huge predictor of self-injury. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes.
It just occurred to me, in terms of your hopefulness and your positive, something to look at is the long-term effects on siblings.
Yeah.
Because, just from my own experience, I've noticed that it's had an amazing positive effect on siblings, which I think might help parents as, going through it, to recognize that. And so I don't know if you've studied it, but just,
We asked about siblings, but we haven't done a longitudinal study, and that would be a really interesting piece to ask. Because you're right, siblings they're often sort of on the sidelines watching this exchange in a way that has really interesting, unique impacts that have never been measured. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm gonna just put that there because these are some resources on our website you can go to and find out about. Yeah.
Time for one more?
Yes, absolutely.
So a conundrum that I'm up against sometimes as an after-school program manager who's pretty well connected with the families that I serve of about 35 youth, is whether, when I become privy of information, like whether or not to tell parents, and my gut instinct is yes, definitely.
Yeah.
No. But then I find myself wondering, if I'm also not making the effort to connect them with resources, which I don't necessarily have time to, because it's not necessarily my area either, am I potentially making the problem worse? And one thing that I think about is the perspective of the teen. So let's say their parents find out and they're like, okay, maybe they wanted to tell their parents but they were afraid to. So, okay, my program manager told my parents and now they knew, but they're not doing anything about it. Maybe it's because they don't care about it. And just thinking about ways that it can fall and potentially make matters worse because the families that I work with lack resources in general. Anyway,
That is a conundrum. Things can always go south.
Yeah.
They always can, for anything. So I wouldn't spend too much time focusing on that because it is a possibility. But in general, most people in the field these days are supporting more parent involvement, not less, partly because we're finding that it matters. But how that happens may be different in your case. So these are kids that they go to the. Are you connected to the school they go to? Is it or are you drawing from all over the place?
I'm drawing from. Well, they live in Mobile. And so I'm not connected with the school as much, but I'm connected with families.
So my advice is going to be, could you loop in, there's usually a crisis team at each school who would have a protocol that would govern all that. And if you can connect with whoever that point person might be at their school, that would probably be a better way for you to handle it than for you going right to the family. But in the cases where that's not possible for whatever reason, I would lean toward telling the family and then maybe having a list of sort of local resources or just ideas about what they can do, like they can go to the school counselor and talk to. It's not going to, no guarantee that it's going to make a big difference, but I got to say, hands down, when we were doing interviews with young people, and granted, it's not a random representative sample of young people we were doing interviews with, but every single one of them said when they were outed by somebody, even though they may have hated it at the moment and they may have had a lot of rancor at the person who outed them, they were glad they did it. And because families, a lot of the healing has to happen in families because that's where some of the contributors are.
Right.
The more you can facilitate that, the better, and withholding information doesn't help. But how that happens and how it's framed is something to be very mindful of. I'm happy to talk with you more about that. Okay. Other stuff? On our website is this one right here. If you just do self-injury in Cornell, which I'm sure our president wouldn't really like, but if you do self-injury in Cornell, you'll find us. We're right there. And we have a variety of resources. We have really used a lot of our amazing students to help translate science into things that are useful, and we have lots and lots there, and there's going to be there's now a new training program for professionals that's up on our brand new training tab, which I'm so excited about. And then there will be one for parents coming in the next few months, which is really based on a lot of what we've learned.
Is your presentation on the website?
It's not on the website, but I'm sure I will probably put it on the website, but you can email me. My email is jlw43@cornell.edu. So email me if you want this. I'll be happy to send you a PDF file. And there's a video that I didn't get to show because I was over, but that is on our website. On the recovery page of our website, you'll see the video that I didn't show.
That was JLW43?
That's right. All right, everybody, thank you so much.